Welcome back, everyone, to our concluding episode of the series, History in the Time of Genocide between Gaza and the World. This is our seventh episode, concluding a series of discussions
Thank you,
with
Adnan.
Dr. Ariel
Thank you for having me.
Salzman. Ariel, welcome back. Well, it's been really so illuminating and interesting to cover histories and intersections from a global, regional, as well as local perspective. And those interrelated layers have cross-cut the discussions at different points in time over the last several episodes. Today, we're going to be opening up not just the past, although we may review some of the things that we discussed in the past, the previous histories and so forth, but we're also talking about global futures. And so this episode is about Gaza and our global future in what happens in Gaza, I think is an argument that you would make. It's an argument we've made on guerrilla history and a couple of other episodes, that the future of the world in some ways hinges on Gaza as a model. And we've seen it and discussed a little bit. I think we'll get into more of it as a model for a certain vision of the future. And of course, also, it is a possibility, or opens up the possibilities for a more hopeful future. Potentially. So anyway, I wanted to turn it over to you to say, what do you think is the place of Gaza, the genocide, the histories that we've been rehearsing and analyzing and discussing together, and that you've been teaching? How is it connected to the sense of transition that we're in, or how it points to larger global processes that we have to be concerned about? How does it illustrate and illuminate those? And what did you mean when you wanted to call this episode Gaza and Global Futures?
Well, I think we have to keep refocusing on Gaza. Gaza's shifted off the center of even Al Jazeera's site, and been replaced with Syria and a host of other events in the region. But the slaughter in Gaza goes on. Just over the last 24 hours, dozens of people were killed. And the targeting is specifically areas where Gazans thought they had some security, and personnel who can help in any way by providing aid or medicine or treatment or rescuing people. So the situation is just awful. And Israel is taking full advantage of this moment. And on top of it, there's rejoicing in Washington. They're gleeful about the fall of Assad, and thinking this is going to open up, what didn't happen in
when they invaded Iraq.
Exactly, the domino effect that they thought would happen. So the whole situation is so catastrophic, and the leadership at the helm is so drunk with power and impunity, and blood. They're all soaked in blood. It's so terrible. So I think we go from this moment of utter despair, utter horror, and we have to think. I think two things, and that was what I was hoping to bring out in the previous episodes. Is on one hand, there's many factors that collude and combine in where we are today, that go well beyond the Palestinians and even the Jewish settlers who went to Palestine and created this state, this settler colonial state, which is now poised to, of course, expand even further into Syria, absorbing the so-called Philadelphia corridor, which is, in with Egypt, and of course toward the Litani River in Lebanon. So, but we have to think about the multiple factors that brought us to this place, as well as the potential at given moments, at given conjunctures, well in the distant past, 100 years ago, before World War II, in the aftermath of World War II, where this future didn't have to be like this. And that's the only place we have to find hope in the past and recognize what could have been. And I'm not saying just counterfactuals or fantasies, where this trajectory could have been derailed, and appreciate now where we are, and perhaps the awakening that has happened across the world in seeing this horror and devastation, and perhaps deflecting and pivoting away from what is certainly a disastrous future for all the planet, all of life on the planet. So, I mean, in terms of how Gaza is a mirror of the futures, there are many layers of this, of course. There's the military aspect, the testing out, as Anthony Lowenstein has said, of new military equipment, of generally the Palestine laboratory when it comes to surveillance equipment. Our own surveillance studies program at Queen's University had at its core actually recognizing the central role of the Israeli occupation of West Bank and Gaza in creating this new era of surveillance capitalism, and the surveillance system, which is monitoring all of us around the world, rich and poor. So there's that aspect. There's the aspect also of these new AI technologies for following people, for targeted killings. Lavender. I mean, they have the parallels in the United States. In 2003, they were using a program called Bug Splat, the Pentagon, to distinguish not between, individuals who, so-called high-profile targets or high-value targets, but as a sort of a ratio of how many people who are unrelated to that target would be allowable to be bombed and killed. The whole notion of collateral damage, which has just gone out the window. No one even talks about it anymore. I mean, it doesn't even figure in Israel's discourse at all. So that even sort of semi-apologetic way of saying, yes, we killed so many innocents for supposedly people who had, who were guilty of some kind of crime or, so-called terrorist attack. So we're at that point now where AI is basically determining life and death for many, many people. We saw the drone attacks, of course, in Pakistan. We saw them in Afghanistan, so they're not confined to the West Bank and Gaza in particular. And of course, the United States has used them prolifically around the world, wherever it judges its interests are at stake. But I think the final component of Gaza is the fact that it is a population, 50% of whom are children. And so we're really looking at a future that has been truncated, destroyed, traumatized. And if they survive, a recent study said that almost 50% of Gazan children wish they were dead. Another 96% said they didn't think that they were going to survive at all. So this is a window on the world's future. Gaza has been destroyed physically, its infrastructure ruined, it's had its environment destroyed, its agriculture destroyed, effluents flowing out in the Mediterranean, where Gazan fishermen used to catch, whatever small fish they could get within the narrow margin that Israel permitted them. So the economy, which was already on its last legs, and its environment, which the UN had already said would be completely unsustainable in 2020, 4 years ago, is now completely ruined. And of course, the tailings and debris and asbestos from all these buildings that have come down, that children are breathing in. So Gaza represents this destroyed, foreshortened future, not only for Gazans, but what, a substantial portion of the world is facing. Of the 8 billion plus people on the earth, somewhat of 3 billion are young people, our people under 20, who will see the worst ravages, not only of these conflagrating wars, but also of the climate holocaust, the climate, because, you know, burned in flames, our planet is on fire. And so we're really talking about generational warfare. What is going on in Gaza is what's going on perhaps at a slower pace against the entire world's youth. It is a war of generations who've sucked up resources, and continue because they've accumulated capital and they've made their place, and they continue to expand their homes and everything else, while the majority of the world suffer without. And this great fraction of the world's population is going to see the worst of the results of what my generation has done, and particularly the global North middle classes as a group, not just their elites, but all of us. So I think when we're talking about Gaza future, we're talking about how it reflects global futures. It reflects what we used to call third world, first world, third world, global north. The global south is the world's youth. That is the global south. That is the new global south. It is a generation um, which is going to reap, the terror and the horror and whatever has been done up to this point. So, that's why I think it's so important. And I think that's why young people have responded so viscerally to what's going on. Um, Not only do they have access to the social media that other people, might find problematic or just ignore, they also see in the children of Gaza and the youth of Gaza reflections of themselves. Um, and they realize so much is at stake and so much is on the line, whether it's the environment or whether it's global order, whether it's human rights, and of course, the punishment for the crime of crimes, genocide, which seems so elusive at this point. So there's an outrage, there's an urgency among the world's youth that responds to this. In a very, very intimate, empathetic fashion.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's because the youth of the North even sees its future, not in the same intensity. And as you said, it's not exactly on the same time scale, but they can see in the crucible of Gaza a vision of a future in which they also will share and take part. And one thing that's been so important is that they have managed to really have an apocalyptic, maybe it's because of the climate crisis and other kinds of threats that are quite existential to the web of life on this earth, that they have been able to understand the moment we're in as a truly critical uncovering, like of a turning point in history. And the actual meaning of apocalypse is uncovering, is making apparent. And I think that's what's happened, is that so many of the forces of imperialism, of ecocide, of genocide, of all of the things that you were just discussing are made so readily apparent. The fact that there isn't really an international regime of law, of human rights, or of humanitarian law that can survive the racism of this colonial and imperial system and of capitalism. And so what they've managed to do rather remarkably is overcome the rampant dehumanization that is actually crucial to sustaining this. They have been able to recognize Palestinians as humans like themselves, and that act of solidarity is what's driving their understanding and appreciation that if it can happen to the people of Palestine, the people of Gaza, it can happen to others in the region, it can happen to others in Africa and Asia, and ultimately it can happen to them and to anyone. So that's been really wonderful and something beautiful to see.
Yeah, and they're staring in the face of this gerontocracy that refuses to acknowledge there's a genocide going on, that refuses to acknowledge the existential threat that they face. And it's just, as we began, just absolutely lethal at more carnage, at more disorder, at the fact that they have no intention, in the case of Syria, of putting war-torn states back together. That is not the point. They want them to suffer. There's glee in suffering. Someone said about Trump, the cruelty is the
Yeah,
point.
it's
The
the point.
cruelty
Well,
is the point. The
this is
cruelty is the
definitely
dehumanizing the point.
this is what I have felt since we've seen the emergence and rise of fascist far right. I mean, maybe even fascist isn't the right word. I mean, Vijay Prashad has suggested using, far right of a special type. It's not a great,
Yeah,
kind
we
of
need
phrase.
to
Doesn't exactly
an
roll off
acronym.
the tongue. Marketing could be better there.
Special, yeah.
But what I think his point is that, fascism had its particular features in the historical epic that emerged. But we're looking at a far right movement that, of course, has some continuities with those, but has many new features and is a product of our particular time. And what we've seen is that there is a real politics of cruelty. The point of Kids in Cages was to show to people, look what we are willing to do. And people celebrated that. They celebrate the, brutality towards migrants. In fact, in many quarters, the many people who die attempting to cross the Mediterranean for, survival, fleeing war and, economic deprivation and the destruction of their societies. And the economic inequities and violence of global capitalism, the deaths, it's actually something that seems almost celebrated in certain quarters. And there is a new part of this uncovering of the horror behind this is how perfectly commensurate it is with normative politics and normative culture in a bankrupt and cruel West. There are some liberal quarters there that are dealing with their contradictions, but by and large, the norm that has opened and portrayed itself and demonstrated itself is perfectly, equitable, perfectly equable, perfect equanimity with the tragedy that's going on. And I think that has been a shock to young people. So I'm glad that you actually talked a little bit about how we have to come back to Gaza, because like you, and this is dating when we're doing the recording, we hope the situation has improved, but there's no signs of any commitment, as you said, for rebuilding societies and states that have been dismantled and torn apart. It didn't happen in Iraq. It didn't happen in Libya. And
in Afghanistan, it
in
didn't
Afghanistan,
for half a century. Yeah,
exactly. So we're justified in being a little cynical about what the real consequences materially are going to be for the destruction of another frontline state, in the region. But one thing that has disturbed me, and I'm so glad that you brought us back to talking about Gaza, is that the glee, that you've been talking about has been accompanied also in some ways by a fracturing of the Palestine solidarity movement in discussing and taking these various positions on, what has happened and unfolded in Syria, while forgetting that no matter what, the genocide is ongoing. And I think some people, could benefit from that refocusing. One dimension of analysis is that I think when we talk about Gaza and global future, the reason why it's so important is because it is a model, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about the ways in which it is. So you talked about technologies of surveillance, fortress walls, control of populations, making populations. A global apartheid, exactly, and the regimes to enforce it militarily and through
from the West Bank
surveillance.
to the Rio Grande. Of
Absolutely, that's
building
right.
walls.
And so
Right?
that's why I think that unless you have those connections that you were making, it's easy for people to get distracted by particular conditions without seeing that if there's no solution for Gaza, there may be no solution for the world. It sits in an important node as a model for how the rest of the system, the global, unequal and oppressive system, is structured. So we have to come back to Gaza and really, understand its links and analogies to the wider processes, because if we lose in Gaza, it's setting such a dangerous precedent. Of course, it's already been set by the neglect, by the, displacement of people, by the wars and the interventions. But this one has captured attention. And if we lose on this one, we're setting such a precedent where it's just okay to do genocide in full view of the entire
It's
world.
also okay not to talk about it.
Right.
It's okay to submit to regimes of intimidation, however they're formulated, to prevent us from expressing our outrage. I mean, and that repercussion, again, students are seeing how the veil of libertarian, liberal rights has been ripped off when it comes to talking about something that's so obvious, so tragic. We're not allowed to talk about it, where it takes courage to even contemplate teaching a course that addresses this issue, and culminates with a discussion with your class about what is genocide. What does the Genocide Convention say? Is there grounds for saying that what is transpiring in Gaza is a case of genocide? And what happens if those people, those genocidaires, are not punished, are not held to account? What happens to the international system as a whole if they're allowed to get away with this, and all the other states that are complicit are allowed to just go on as business as usual? No problem.
Yeah. I think one thing that really disturbs and distresses me is picking up on the intimidation and the inability even to bring knowledge and expertise, which is what we've been doing and you've been doing in particular in your teaching. But in this series, what we've been trying to do is the dismissal of any standard of expertise. I mean, so there's absolutely no valuing of what might have been called the reality-based community, if I can
Yeah.
remember from the
Well, that
George.
was the Bush, yeah, the George
That
Bush,
was, like,
yeah.
well, you guys are a
That's like
part of
we
the
dismiss it,
reality-based
yeah.
community. Yeah, dismissing the reality, be like facts, like evidence, analysis,
Expertise, yeah,
expertise,
yeah.
study, and so when people dismiss the
Science.
idea, right, when they dismiss the, genocide as, well, that's not a genocide. I mean, really all they're saying is we don't really care about the fact that there is a legal definition. The experts in international law have one after the another over time. Maybe there was like caution in the beginning to really come out and say that because they wanted to wait and see. And so, but now it's pretty unanimous in serious circles of scholarship and expertise in international law that what's taking place in Gaza in front of the world is a genocide. But to dismiss it and say, oh, well, it's not, or, we don't accept that definition, is basically saying we don't care and we don't have any kind of common standard that we will work with about how to judge any of these things. It's just naked raw power. And what we're seeing is the uncovering of, when pushed, finally to make this kind of liberal regime of international rights actually apply to a colonial subjugated people in the global south, the Palestinians in this case, that because it undermines programs for the region and support, for an ally, willing to dismiss all of that and willing to throw it all away, and just center themselves on avowed ignorance, unwillingness to even look, to speak, and also naked racism. It's become very ugly and very obvious how comfortable people are with the racist presumptions of the dehumanization of people they're watching being killed and starved and battered to death. It's just absolutely, it's an opening into a horrific future. I mean, that's the point, is that there is a horrific future where these extreme forces that I think we have talked about as being embedded and having genealogies and histories that go pretty far back, is that these are being recovered and valorized and adopted in a much more obvious, overt, and comfortable way in the new norms of politics, particularly well in the U.S., but also you see it in Europe. Um, all these far right parties are, almost all of them are the substantial opposition or in power. And in any future elections, they all seem poised to do very well. And that's why when you said it's all of us and in the global north, I mean, the complicity is really wide. I mean, I think, and
And
deep.
it's complicity in the region too. I mean, when
Oh,
Akbar Ahmed
absolutely.
years ago, called out in New York Times and all the Arab regimes for not doing something about the Palestinians. The same is true. It's worse. It's worse now. And as soon as the gates opened with the Abraham Accords from Morocco to the Gulf, they all started buying Israeli technology because they know this is the way they reinforce their regimes. This is the way they spy on dissidents. This is the way they torture them. And this is the way they also keep out the Untermenschen in the region. They kill people from the Horn of Africa, trying to get in Saudi Arabia. They kill, Yemenis, poor Yemenis. So this inequality in the region is also something, that is going on and part of the surveillance. Yeah.
And the sectarianism that is being exploited as well, also, in this is very disturbing. I mean, this is one of the things that I was, it's very hard to find any hopeful developments in the last, 14, 15 months of the genocide. But one thing is that at least at a people's level, there was great solidarity with the Palestinian cause, and more people beginning, it seemed, to understand some of the processes we've been talking about and the importance of seeking justice and a political solution and, humanizing the Palestinians. But there are clearly limits to that. And what we've seen is the reopening of a lot of the most regressive forces reasserting themselves, in this moment. And I mean, this is, I think kind of disturbing, because that's one of the things that at least I was sort of hopeful that at a people's level, there's this
Well,
solidarity.
I think on the people's level, there is also is broadening. I mean, we know that from our own wonderful students, our own courageous students, that they've never shied away from saying, even Palestinian Canadian students have said, yes, Gaza's going on, but so is Sudan, and people are being killed in Ukraine. All of these are proxy wars, for in this post unipolar moment in trying to define a new order, at the expense, of course, of the world's future, because we don't have any time to wait to deal with the existential threats, whether it is the rapidly changing climate, which is producing fires and floods and everything else, or whether it is the threat of a new generation of atomic weapons, which is right out there. And of course, because of the Israelis and the right sabotaging of any effort, yeah, yeah, to give Iran some incentive not to develop its own nuclear arsenal, which you can't fault the Iranians for wanting it, given the nuclearization of that whole region, of South Asia, and they're just on the cusp of that. And then, of course, the utter, unaccountability. We have no idea of the actual, except through, leaks and stuff like that, and people who've been punished very severely, Israelis, for revealing how large an arsenal Israel has, and what it consists of. We have this, situation now. So, yeah, I think, the world's youth, in general, see what's happening. They see the mirror of their own future in Gaza. And it is so tragic, but it is so hopeful that they are responding. Um, so I just wanted to also just to go back, step
Yeah,
back
I'm
for a
wondering if
second.
you want to
Yeah,
draw some
yeah,
threads from our
yeah,
previous episodes
yeah.
together here as a final coda for what we've
Yeah,
been
because I
talking about,
think
what you
one of the
wanted to
things
say.
you and I agree on that we do need new terms to talk about this. Uh, one, because not only because our sometimes our slogans have become a bit stale, and unrealistic to the extent that they don't reflect the horrific realities on the ground. And yes, we need hope, but we also need pragmatism, and we need to find new allies. We need to broaden this. We need to bring people into the discussion, but also because there are factors that slip outside the conversation when one confines the goal of liberation to be the nation state, and the thinking about the multiple factors that make up historical processes and change as solely being linked to the world that we've imagined in the modern period. So you and I, being pre-modernists, have that somewhat liberated view of what was and perhaps what could be. I mean, the nation state is a relatively recent phenomenon. Multi-ethnic, multi-religious, unfortunately, colonial empires, were the rule for several hundred years. But before that, we had in the Persian kingdom under Cyrus, a model of a multi-religious kingdom. That goes way back into history. So I think that the themes that I tried to bring out are themes the way perhaps we can rethink how this moment we've come to this moment, but also how we can reframe it and maybe peel away people who otherwise think they have these ideological commitments that are so inflexible, and force them into these either or ways of thinking, and that I include many Jewish Israelis. So the main themes that we went over were how, first of all, how it has been a tendency, despite the efforts of many medievalists, including scholars like Mark Cohen, to to disengage the Middle Eastern past, the Muslim past, the Islamic past from the European past. It's constantly, the way that people imagine the past, of course, is projected into the future. But there's this overlay, this deflection from what Euro Christendom did to Jews and its other minorities, Gypsies, Roma, Sinti, uh, Protestants to Catholics, Catholics to Protestants, as being this inevitable way that the world functions. And this from time immemorial conflict between religions, which really wasn't the case. I mean, no region of the world had the track record that 1,000 years of European history had. And it was only interrupted for less than a century before we got Nazism. And recent studies have also shown, and these are economists and sociologists who are looking at the way that the same places where massacres happened in the Middle Ages in the 14th century were also epicenters of anti Semitism in the 20th century. I mean, yeah, in the 20th century. So I think we need that broader landscape, one, to disengage two very different trajectories when it came to majority minority relations. Um, of course, and utopia, there were persecutions of Jews and Christians in various places at different times, in Yemen and Eastern Iran and Mashhad, forced conversion. But that doesn't contradict the basic tendency, which is there is no model that matches that of Europe. And that's how Europe became Europe. We have to recognize that as well. The European nation state was not born just like that. It was born by continuous purging of the other, from the Middle Ages onward. So I think that's one thing, and this holds true. This sort of buildup of uh, the Arabs as Nazis, the Arabs as philo-fascists during World War II. They weren't the only ones who saw their enemy's enemy as a possible liberator. Chandra Bose in India. made overtures to the Germans. The Japanese, as our colleague in Turkey tells us, Seljuk Esenbal, the Japanese were in Indonesia organizing against the Dutch. And so, the very moments which seem the most horrific, of course, for the Chinese as well as many Europeans, also open possibilities for colonized people. So that whole narrative, of collaborators. I mean, Netanyahu has even gone so far. A recent tape of his said that he believed that the Mufti of Jerusalem
Yeah.
planted the idea of
Right. He's
the
the source of it.
Holocaust, yes, of the Holocaust, in
Yeah.
Hitler's mind.
Like
I mean, just
pogrom after pogrom for a millennia,
yeah,
it never
yeah,
occurred to them that
yeah,
history was what,
yeah.
might have motivated it. Yeah. Yeah. Absurd.
So that's I think the first thing is that, is to disabuse that notion that there's some equivalence between the longue durée of Islamic hate history and that of Euro-Christian history. The second thing that we have to focus on, and this is something, of course, that civil rights leaders have talked about for years, um, is the false promise of emancipations and the fact that in the United States alone, the you know enfranchisement, supposed emancipation of people of African descent and other groups who were similarly treated, whether it was Chicanos or Asians who were brought in, um, workers, yes, were was failed. It was limited. There were efforts, and then it completely failed, and the backlash was terrible. And the backlash produced lynching, produced decades and decades of lynching. And we don't know how many hundreds of people were lynched, including some non African Americans were lynched. In one case, at least one Jewish person who was lynched during this time period. So, the false promise of emancipation, the backsliding of emancipation, and how that in turn produced what one could call, following Frederick Dubé, reactive nationalisms like Zionism, um, and which unabashedly espoused European modes for creating a nation state, a settler colonial state, what had been done previously from the 16th century onward in the Americas and beyond. So, that is the center. And again, this failed emancipation had different moments. And for European Jews, of course, the 1930s was one in which, that the gravity and perhaps of that moment was clear. But it wasn't just Europe that was complicit in the Holocaust. And, one can talk about whether the tracks to the concentration camps should have been bombed. The fact was, many more thousands of Jews could have escaped, especially those in the West. Those in the East were succored by the Soviet Union. 1.5 million Jews found refuge in the Soviet
Refuge there.
Union
Yeah.
outside the Nazi occupied zones. But thousands more could have been brought to Western Europe, could have been brought to North America, could have been brought to the Caribbean. Roosevelt's attempt at Evian, met with like complete disdain by the Canadians. Canada had plenty of room, even in these temporary visas programs, for 5 years or something like that, to see what. But none of that was done. So I think you can't think about Jewish despair during the war and after the war without recognizing not only what the Nazis did, with their mobile killing units and their concentration camps, but also how the world responded. And we have to bear that in mind, of course, now as well, of, you know, how we respond, how we are not responding, how we're
Yes,
not,
to subsequent refugee
yes,
crises that have been
subsequent
created by.
refugee crisis, but also subsequent crimes of mass extermination, of mass murder, crimes of war, crimes against humanity, and of course, genocide itself. But all of which do not end there. They don't end there. They don't stop there. They produce refugee crises, which is, what happened then. And we're now in one of the worst refugee crises. In fact, the number of forced migrants is even higher than in the post-war period. And the effort to solve that refugee crisis then produced yet another, both in terms of the mandate and the Balfour, that seems very clearly linked to what do we do with the Jews after World War One? Where do we place them? We don't want them here. And of course, after World War Two, when the British, were trying to leave their colonial domains. So, in terms of where we went from there, we talked about seeing not just a series of Arab-Israeli wars, this, but actually looking at this period in which, in the midst of the Cold War, Europe and the United States was trying to recolonize the region, and how this put inordinate strain on individual post-colonial states in such a way that it was very difficult for them to manage and even support the Palestinians, who were the most dispossessed, outside of the Algerians, in terms of the region's lingering colonial legacy, and how that just propelled forward and also situated Israel within that recolonizing axis that included France and Britain, and of course,
After 67, in
after
particular, the
60,
U.S.
US,
Yeah.
yes, and how they became part of the bastion and the structure of US hegemony in the region to control a strategically important center of global energy, in this period of, post-war recovery and, of course, economic expansion in the 60s and 70s. And from there, we talked about the not just the wars, the consequence of wars, the militarization of the Palestinian movement, the adoption of armed struggle in its various iterations, the kind of crimes of that were committed, human rights violations were committed by the Israelis before 1967 against Palestinians who found themselves within the borders of the 49 armistice, including there's a new film out that I have yet to watch, but promises to be very important, on Lod, and where they interview people who had been children at that time, who were forced to go into the mosque of Lod, where they had killed all the worshippers there, and the children were sent in days later to haul out the bodies. So
Reminds us
they,
of the
yeah,
Hebron,
yeah,
the
yeah.
massacre, Ramadan
Well, later,
massacre. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Um,
During the Oslo
so
era.
yeah, so many crimes of war beginning in the 40s, when basically these militias, these Jewish militias, paved the way for these asymmetrical attacks, which were strategically aimed at derailing peace. And then on the other side, to really start rethinking what peace meant for the Palestinians. Uh, it never meant an end to violence. It produced a new level of quotidian violence, whether it was in the occupation itself, which promised peace and security for the Israelis, of course, or whether it was at Oslo, which eventually robbed Palestinians of the even possibility of having any form of territoriality, in which the parts of this supposedly future Palestinian state were contiguous and could allow for meaningful economic, cultural, and political
Social and
development.
political development. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, and with all obtaining at the same time dramatic acceleration over the course of the Oslo peace process that
yeah,
was
the utter,
attenuated and kept being
yeah,
delayed. The acceleration of the colonization process of settlements and expropriation of land during that time period, and the building of the apartheid wall during that period.
yeah,
So you had these huge forces that were making the possibility of a viable Palestinian society and polity, impossible,
what Jonathan
during the
Cook calls
peace. That's right.
disappearing Palestine.
Right.
Just
Hmm.
and currently over 750,000 Israeli settlers are in the West Bank, and they're not just in the settlements, they're also continually making what are called new outposts, which become the nuclei of future settlements, and they're protected, defended, and emboldened by not only the current political coalition in power, but also the police and the military. And then, last but not least, thinking about what perpetuates this horrific imbalance in power, this continual torture and torment of the Palestinians, not as simply this, again, Jewish Israelis versus Palestinians, but as a global nexus, which is now clearly trying to create and sustain what I've called a greater Israel. And that's three components, which include the sort of change in constituencies in the United States, in which Christian Zionists hold a huge sway, especially in the Republican Party, but across the board. So that's one, that vastly outnumber Jewish Americans, who in turn have become
Maybe three to
increasingly
one.
yeah, more,
Right.
more than a
Might be
2.4,
maybe 5 to 1.
to
Yeah.
something like that.
Yes.
And Jewish Americans, especially younger Jews, who are completely turned off by Israel, see this as antithetical to the kind of values that they have, multiculturalism or whatever liberal ideas. And they don't have the kind of affinities of other generations of Jews. So hedging their bets, Israeli politicians have made common cause with Christian Zionists. And a new generation, I think, a new phenomenon, we've talked about this, of Judaism is intensely influenced by this evangelical movement, and the messianicism, and see it, as compatible and maybe even syncretistic on some levels. And the other components, of course, being the military industrial complex in both countries, which is almost seamless, and where payments to Israel get translated back to purchases on US manufacturers, and those US manufacturers uh, providing jobs for lots of working class Americans throughout the United States, all of which are combining to not only sustain the settlements and push them forward, but to expand Israel itself, um, with a vision that is, centered into this Old Testamental, you know, theology, from the river to the river. Forget about from the
From
river to the
from
sea,
the sea to the
from the Nile
Euphrates. Yeah.
to the Euphrates.
Yeah, that's true. Nile. That's right. It's Nile to the
And
Euphrates.
from the
That's right.
Nile to the
Yeah.
Nile, from the
River
Nile
to
to
the
the
river.
Euphrates. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, uh, I just like to conclude by saying that I sort of had a test drive of this course with my students. I want to thank them all. They were wonderful, and they were sincere, and they were brave, and we all realized we were working with great pressure on us. And I think, and I'm looking forward to their responses, because in their final exams they're going to talk more about this. But it's been a very difficult year to teach Palestinian history, and I know that's shared by many brave people, many academics, many of whom are being punished and censured, some of whom have actually even been fired, stripped of tenure. Um, and so, I want to express my solidarity with them and with us, but especially for our students, because our students have shown themselves to be extremely brave, and our administrations, unfortunately, extremely cowardly, and have prevented them to the best of their abilities from learning, from expressing, from using their rights under the Charter here in Canada or under the Bill of Rights in the United States, from assembly, from speaking their minds and voicing their outrage at the world's indifference to the plight of a people in whom they see their own futures.
Well, Ariel, I'm really hopeful that the kinds of conversations you've managed to have with your brave students will happen with people who watch this series, listen, learn from it, and bring the knowledge and the analysis that you've been so generously sharing to their friends, family, into their workplaces. Because I think, there's been a real wealth of historical analysis and contemporary political analysis that's pretty unique in terms of the framework and the kinds of connections that I think is more capacious in some ways and has a more politically inclusive mode for people to engage and to realize what's genuinely at stake. And I think a lot of people are afraid of engaging in and learning more about the situation because of some of the polarizing language, the way there's a lot of obfuscation that isn't grounded in a historical analysis of the larger global and regional processes in which it should be seen. And I think this has been very valuable for people. And so I want to thank you for sharing.
And I do want to end by, thanking my teachers, including Rashid Khalidi, and the people who have done the lion's share of the work in this field, whether it's Ilan Pape, whether it's Sarah Roy, Moeen Rabbani, my old friend Norman Finkelstein, and many, many other scholars, Shirin Sekali, who have really pioneered, Bishara Dumani, who really pioneered the field of Palestinian history and have helped me become a teacher of sorts, of course, with a slightly different focus, to share this with students.
Absolutely. And that scholarship is ongoing and rich. And
we'll provide a bibliography to
yes, we will
so
include
that you further reading. Yeah.
Further readings in each of the episodes in the episode notes or in the YouTube video description. So whatever format you come across this, you should be able to learn more where you can go for good, serious resources. And so thank you all for your patience. Hopefully many of you made it through all these 7 episodes. And we look forward to having more fruitful discussions with scholars, activists, academics, and so on to understand the world better. Thanks so much. Until next time, solidarity.